He hauled explosives because he didn't care if he lived or died. But to save the woman who finally brought him back to life, he must use the very dynamite that haunts his nightmares to bring down a mountain and unleash a miracle. Welcome to our channel, your campfire destination for Western tales of rugged romance, fierce familial love, and the profound compassion that heals broken spirits. This story leaves us with a powerful truth. True redemption means using the ashes of your worst mistakes to water the seeds of your future. If you're ready for an unforgettable journey, hit subscribe, tap the like button, and share this video. Comment your favorite part of the Wild West below, and let's strike a match.
The sound of a world ending isn't a gunshot. It's the dry, hollow crack of an auctioneer's gavel. Josephine Sterling could still hear that sound echoing in her ears, louder than the screech of the locomotive that had just abandoned her at the edge of the world. She stood ankle-deep in the freezing, churning mud of the Denver Frontier Station, the icy wind tearing at the frayed wool of her once elegant Boston traveling coat. Around her, the platform was a chaotic symphony of desperate men. Miners shouting over the roar of escaping steam, the sharp crack of bullwhips, and the suffocating stench of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and burning coal. It was a brutal, ugly place, and it was entirely indifferent to the fact that Josephine had just lost everything. Her family's newspaper empire, her father's pristine reputation, her home. All of it had been swallowed by a mountain of forged debts, liquidated in a single afternoon to faceless creditors. Now her trembling bare fingers clutched the only thing left to her name, a crumpled, water-stained deed to a barren plot of dirt in Silver Ridge, Colorado. Jo shoved the paper deep into her satchel, her knuckles white. She had to get to Silver Ridge. She had to uncover the truth behind her father's sudden ruin and death. But survival was a luxury that was rapidly running out of time. Through the dense curtain of falling snow, Jo spotted them. Two men wearing heavy canvas dusters were systematically shoving their way through the crowd. They weren't miners or ranchers. They moved with the predatory, synchronized grace of men who hunted other humans for a living. The taller one, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his beard, held up a piece of paper to a station master. Even from 50 yards away, Jo recognized the charcoal sketch of her own face. The creditors hadn't just taken her home, they wanted her too. If she was caught, the term indentured servitude would be a polite fiction for what awaited her in the dark corners of a mining camp. Panic, cold and sharp as a straight razor, sliced through her chest. Jo spun around, her impractical leather boots slipping in the frozen muck. She pushed toward the ticket office, a wooden shack hammered together against the wind. "Silver Ridge," Jo gasped, slamming her palms on the rough-hewn counter. "When is the next stagecoach?" The ticket master, a man with a face like a dried apple, didn't even look up from his ledger. "Left an hour ago, lady. Then a wagon, a horse, anything." "You ain't listening," he grunted, finally raising his eyes, taking in her ruined eastern clothes with a smirk. "Look up." Jo looked past the station roof. Looming in the distance, a massive wall of jagged peaks tore at the sky. A bruised, violent purple mass of clouds was violently swallowing the mountains. "Predator's Pass is freezing over," the man said, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow. "By nightfall, that road will be 20 feet deep in snow. Nothing's getting through until the spring thaw. You're stuck here." Jo's breath hitched. She looked over her shoulder. The scarred bounty hunter was pointing in her direction, his eyes locking onto her distinctive blue coat. He tapped his partner's arm. They started moving. "Think, Jo. Think." She backed away from the ticket counter, melting into the shadows of a towering stack of lumber. Her eyes swept the loading docks. If there were no passenger coaches, she needed freight. At the far end of the yard, separated from the chaos of the main platform, stood a massive, reinforced Studebaker wagon. It was hitched to a team of 6 heavily muscled draft horses, their breath pluming like dragon fire in the freezing air. The wagon bed was covered by a thick, tar-stained canvas, tied down tight. But it was the wooden crate stacked near the tailgate that caught her eye. Stamped in faded, menacing red ink were the words, "Danger, nitroglycerin, and blasting powder. No sane man would ride with that much unstable explosive into a blizzard. But whoever owned that wagon was finishing tying off the heavy leather straps. He was leaving. Now. Jo didn't hesitate. She waited until the driver, a towering silhouette wrapped in a long, dark coat, turned his back to secure the lead horse. With a burst of desperate adrenaline, Jo sprinted across the mud. She scrambled over the lowered tailgate, tearing her fingernails on the rough wood, and slipped beneath the heavy, suffocating canvas. It was pitch black inside, reeking of sulfur, oiled canvas, and raw pine. She squeezed herself into a narrow gap between two wooden crates, pulling her knees to her chest, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth to muffle her ragged breathing. For a terrifying minute, there was nothing but the howling of the wind. Then the heavy thud of boots approached the back of the wagon. Jo squeezed her eyes shut. Please, please don't look. The canvas didn't lift. Instead, a voice cut through the howling wind, low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of warmth. "If you're going to stow away on a powder wagon, sweetheart," the voice rumbled, vibrating through the wooden floorboards, "you might want to wipe the mud off your boots before you step on my tailgate." The canvas was violently ripped back. Pale gray winter light flooded the wagon. Jo gasped, shrinking back against a crate of dynamite. Standing over her was a man who looked like the frontier had chewed him up and spat him out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered like ancient oak. A battered Stetson cast a dark shadow over his eyes, but Jo could see the harsh, unforgiving lines of his jaw. The collar of his duster was turned up against the cold, revealing a glimpse of burn scars crawling up his neck, angry and textured against his skin. He didn't look surprised. He looked utterly, dangerously annoyed. "Out!" he commanded. One word. Absolute finality. "Please," Jo whispered, her teeth chattering. She scrambled to a crouch, reaching into her satchel and pulling out the crinkled piece of paper. "I have a deed. To land in Silver Ridge. I can pay you when we get there." Vance Calder didn't even glance at the paper. His cold gray eyes remained fixed on her face. "I haul powder. I don't haul passengers. And I sure as hell don't haul desperate women in silk dresses who are going to freeze to death before we hit the timberline. Get out." "I won't freeze. I can work," Jo pleaded, her voice cracking. "I can—" "Hey, you there! Driver!" The shout came from the mud-slicked street behind the wagon. Vance's gaze shifted from Jo to the space over his shoulder. Jo's blood ran cold. She peeked past Vance's broad frame. The two bounty hunters had arrived. The scarred man rested his hand casually on the butt of the revolver strapped to his thigh. His partner spread out, cutting off the exit. "We're looking for a woman," the scarred hunter said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Easterner, about yay high, dark hair. Stole a considerable sum from our employer. We have reason to believe she might be hiding around these freight docks." Jo stopped breathing. She pressed herself so hard against the explosive crate she felt the wood splinter against her spine. Vance didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a massive barrier between Jo and the hunters. The wind whipped the hem of his duster, revealing the heavy iron of a Colt .45 at his hip, but he made no move to draw it. "Ain't seen no woman," Vance said. His voice was flat, bored. The scarred hunter took a step closer, his eyes narrowing at the partially lifted canvas. "Mind if we take a look? Just to be sure. $50 for your trouble." "I mind." The air between the men seemed to freeze, growing colder than the incoming blizzard. The second hunter chuckled, unfastening the leather thumb brake on his holster. "It wasn't a request, friend," the scarred man sneered. "Step aside. We're searching the wagon." Jo closed her eyes. It was over. A shootout would ignite the cargo. If the bullets didn't kill them, the nitroglycerin would vaporize them all. But the gunshot never came. Instead, there was a sharp, distinct shh. Jo opened her eyes. Vance hadn't drawn his gun. He had struck a sulfur match against his thumbnail. The sudden flare of yellow light illuminated his face, casting deep, terrifying shadows over the ruined, scarred flesh of his jaw. He calmly raised a cheap cheroot to his lips and puffed until the end glowed an angry, fiery orange. Then, with agonizing slowness, Vance lowered his hand. He held the burning match just inches above the open lip of a wooden crate, a crate where fine, black blasting powder had spilled, dusting the floorboards directly beneath the flame. The two bounty hunters froze. The color drained from the scarred man's face. "You want to search my rig?" Vance whispered. His voice barely carried over the wind, but it possessed a quiet, unhinged madness that made Joe's stomach drop. "Be my guest. Just be careful lifting the tarp. This batch of nitro is sweating. If you drop the canvas too hard, there won't be enough of you left to scrape off the depot walls." The silence that followed was deafening. Vance stared at them, his eyes dead, the burning match hovering millimeters from the explosive dust. He didn't care if he lived or died. Joe could see it in his posture. He was a ghost, and ghosts didn't fear the fire. The hunters saw it too. The scarred man slowly raised his hands, stepping backward into the mud. "You're crazy, you son of a bitch!" "I've been told," Vance agreed mildly. He flicked the match out, tossing it into the snow. Without another word, the two bounty hunters turned and vanished into the swirling chaos of the station crowd, opting to preserve their lives over their paycheck. Vance watched them go for a long moment. Then he slowly turned his head, looking back into the wagon where Joe was huddled, trembling violently. He looked at her ruined boots, her shivering shoulders, and the pure, unadulterated terror in her eyes. "You've got 10 seconds to climb out, lady," Vance said, "before I tie this canvas down." "If I stay here, they'll kill me," Joe whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "If you ride with me into that pass," Vance replied, his tone devoid of any empathy, "the cold will kill you slower. Your choice." He didn't wait for her answer. Vance dropped the heavy canvas tarp, plunging Joe back into utter darkness. A moment later, the wagon lurched violently. The crack of a whip echoed like a rifle shot, and the 6 massive draft horses strained against their harnesses. Joe fell backward against the crates as the heavy wheels crunched through the freezing mud. She wrapped her arms around her knees, burying her face in her coat, shivering uncontrollably. She was riding a rolling bomb into a death storm, driven by a man who had nothing to lose. But as the sounds of the Denver station faded, replaced by the howling, desolate scream of the mountain wind, Josephine Sterling realized one undeniable truth. She was alive. And for now, that would have to be enough. The darkness inside the wagon was absolute, but it was the cold that felt like a living thing. It didn't just chill Josephine's skin. It clawed through the damp wool of her coat, sank its teeth into her bones, and gnawed at whatever warmth she had left. For the first hour, the climb out of the Denver basin was a steady, agonizing jolt of iron-banded wheels over frozen ruts. Joe wedged herself between 2 crates of blasting powder, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her teeth clicking together so violently she tasted blood where she had bitten her tongue. Every lurch of the heavy Studebaker wagon sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Beneath her, the nitroglycerin shifted, a volatile cargo that could vaporize them both if the wagon hit a boulder too hard. She focused on breathing. In, out. You are alive. You are not a prisoner. But as the hours bled together, the incline grew terrifyingly steep. The steady rhythm of the 6 draft horses slowed to a grueling, straining slog. The wind, which had been a distant howl at the station, was now a physical force, battering the heavy canvas tarp like the fists of an angry god. Joe couldn't feel her feet anymore. Her hands, clad only in thin, fashionable kid-leather gloves, were stiff, unresponsive claws. The high-altitude air was painfully thin, turning every breath into a lungful of inhaled glass shards. She was going to freeze to death. The realization wasn't born of panic, but of quiet, terrifying logic. Vance Calder hadn't been making an idle threat to scare her. He had stated a geographical fact. Suddenly, the wagon lurched to a violent, jarring halt. The heavy wooden brake block screamed against the rear wheels. The horses whinnied, their massive hooves slipping and scraping against solid ice. Jo was thrown forward, her shoulders slamming hard into a crate. She choked back a cry, curling into a tight ball, waiting for the blast. None came, only the deafening roar of the blizzard outside. A moment later, the thick canvas at the rear of the wagon was yanked back. The blinding white fury of Predator's Pass poured into the darkness, carrying a blast of wind that knocked the remaining breath from Joe's lungs. Framed against the swirling maelstrom was Vance Calder. Snow clung to his heavy duster and frosted the dark scruff of his jaw. His gray eyes swept the interior of the wagon, finding her huddled in the corner. He didn't look surprised to see her still breathing, nor did he look relieved. He just looked tired, the deep lines bracketing his mouth carved by years of harsh weather and harder living. "Out!" he yelled over the wind. Jo blinked, snow immediately clinging to her eyelashes. She tried to uncurl her legs, but her joints were locked in frozen agony. I can't. My legs." Vance didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He reached into the wagon, grabbed the lapels of her ruined wool coat, and hauled her out into the storm. Jo hit the ground, and her legs instantly buckled. She fell hard to her knees in knee-deep snow. The cold was a physical blow, shocking her system so violently she couldn't even gasp. "Get up," Vance barked. You're leaving me here?" Jo stammered, wrapping her arms around her ribs, squinting up at him through the blinding white. "You can't. I'll die in minutes." Vance stepped to the side, gesturing sharply to their surroundings. "Look around, Boston. Take a good long look." Jo forced herself to stand, leaning heavily against the frozen tailgate. Through the swirling vortex of snow, she finally saw where they were. They weren't on a road. They were on a jagged shelf of rock, no wider than the wagon itself, carved into the side of a massive vertical cliff. To her right, a wall of black stone shot up into the storm. To her left, less than 3 feet from the wagon's wheels, was a sheer, dizzying drop into a chasm so deep the bottom was lost in the whiteout. "This is the throat of Predator's Pass," Vance shouted, his voice hard and flat. "The ice is 2 inches thick under this snow. The horses are losing their footing, and the nitro in those crates is getting too cold. If it freezes, it crystallizes. If it crystallizes, the slightest friction will blow this entire mountain face into orbit." Jo stared at the precipice, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need a swamper, and you're the only warm body I've got." Vance stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking the worst of the wind. "I told you I don't haul passengers. You want to make it to Silver Ridge, you earn your oxygen." He marched to the side of the wagon and unhooked a massive, iron-banded wedge of wood attached to a thick chain. He dropped it into the snow at Joe's feet. It weighed at least 20 pounds. "That's a brake shoe." Vance pointed a thick, leather-clad finger at it. "When we hit a steep incline, the team can't pull the dead weight without slipping backward. When I yell, you shove that shoe behind the rear wheel to chock it. It gives the horses 5 seconds to breathe and reset their hooves before they pull again." Jo stared at the heavy block of wood, then at her trembling, freezing hands. I don't know if I have the strength." "Then we slide backward off that cliff," Vance said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "And it won't matter because the drop will kill us before the cold does." He reached into the storage box beneath the driver's bench and pulled out a heavy, fleece-lined buffalo hide coat. It was battered, stained with axle grease, and smelled heavily of horse sweat and old tobacco. He threw it at her. It hit Jo in the chest, heavy enough to make her stagger. "Put it on," Vance ordered, "and take these." He tossed a pair of thick, stiff leather work gloves into the snow beside her. "Your fancy city gloves are useless. You'll lose your fingers to frostbite in an hour." Jo didn't argue. Her survival instinct, honed by months of watching her father's empire crumble, flared to life, burning away the panic. She shed her useless, soaking wet wool coat, the wind slicing through her silk blouse for one agonizing second before she shoved her arms into the massive buffalo hide. It swallowed her petite frame entirely, falling past her knees, but the residual warmth trapped in the heavy hide was instant salvation. She pulled on the stiff leather gloves, flexing her fingers to gain some semblance of control. "Listen to me carefully," Vance said, stepping into her line of sight. He didn't yell this time. His voice dropped to a low, deadly serious register that cut right through the howling wind. "You don't ride in the box anymore. You walk behind the wagon. You keep your eyes on the left rear wheel. If you slip, don't grab the wagon, or you'll pull yourself under the iron rim. You fall. You roll toward the rock wall. Do you understand?" Joe looked up into his gray eyes. For a fraction of a second, beneath the cold, hardened exterior, she saw something else. The hyper-vigilance of a man who intimately knew the cost of failure. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was trying to keep them alive. She lifted her chin, her jaw setting in a stubborn line. "I understand." Vance studied her for a moment, searching her face for weakness. Finding only a desperate, defiant resolve, he gave a single curt nod. "When I yell, 'Chalk!' you slam that shoe under the wheel. Don't hesitate." Vance turned his back on her, climbing up the side of the wagon with practiced agility. He settled onto the driver's bench, unwinding the thick leather reins from the brake lever. Joe bent down and grabbed the iron chain attached to the brake shoe. It was freezing, the cold biting even through the thick leather work gloves. She dragged it toward the rear left wheel, positioning herself exactly as he had instructed, her back to the terrifying drop of the cliff. "Here!" Vance roared, cracking the whip over the heads of the lead horses. The wagon groaned, the wood shrieking in protest. The 6 massive beasts lunged forward, their hooves striking sparks against the hidden ice. The wagon lurched, spraying Joe with freezing slush. She leaned into the wind, dragging the heavy iron-banded block, her eyes locked on the turning wheel. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead beneath the heavy buffalo coat. But she moved. 10 yards, 20 yards. The incline grew sharper. The horses were screaming now, a sound of pure animal exertion. Joe saw the wagon inch backward between strides, the wheels fighting for traction on the treacherous ice. "Chuck!" Vance's voice tore through the blizzard. Joe didn't think. She threw her entire body weight forward, kicking the heavy wooden shoe directly behind the massive iron-rimmed wheel. The wagon slid back half an inch and slammed into the block with a sickening thud. The chain snapped taut. The massive vehicle held. Up on the bench, Vance let the horses drop their heads, their sides heaving, steam billowing from their nostrils. He held the brake lever tight, giving them the promised 5 seconds of rest. Joe stood behind the wheel, her chest heaving, her legs trembling so badly she thought she might collapse. But the wagon hadn't fallen. The explosives hadn't detonated. She had done it. "Pull it loose!" Vance yelled. "Yeah!" The horses lunged again. The wheel rolled forward, freeing the block. Joe yanked the chain, dragging the shoe out of the way, and stumbled forward in the wagon's wake, ready to do it all over again. There were no more words spoken between them. There was no time for apologies, for explanations, or for fear. There was only the mountain, the ice, and the grueling, rhythmic cycle of survival. Walk, wait, chalk, pull, walk. As the hours dragged on, Josephine Sterling, the heiress who had never known a day of physical labor in her life, died on that mountain pass. The woman who dragged the heavy iron chain through the knee-deep snow, her face raw from the wind, her muscles screaming in agony, was someone entirely new. She was a swamper, and she was going to live to see Silver Ridge. Night fell on Predator's Pass not as a gentle darkening, but as a suffocating shroud of black ice and screaming wind. For Josephine Sterling, the universe had shrunk to 3 horrifyingly simple elements: the agonizing burn in her lungs, the slick, treacherous ice beneath her boots, and the massive iron-rimmed wheel of the Studebaker wagon. Walk, wait, chalk, pull, walk. She had lost track of time. It could have been 3 hours. It could have been 10. The heavy buffalo hide coat, which had initially been her salvation, now felt like a lead coffin pressing down on her shoulders. Her arms, wholly unaccustomed to physical labor, shook with a violent, involuntary tremor every time she hauled the 20-pound wooden brake shoe through the knee-deep drifts. Up on the driver's bench, Vance Calder was a shadow carved from stone. He didn't look back. He didn't offer encouragement. He simply drove, his voice a gravelly whip that commanded the 6 exhausted draft horses to keep moving, inch by agonizing inch, up the sheer face of the mountain. The temperature plummeted. The snow turned into tiny razor-sharp shards of ice that bit into the exposed skin of Joe's cheeks. Then, the rhythm broke. The led horses hit a patch of solid, wind-scoured black ice. The massive animals scrambled, iron horseshoes striking useless sparks against the rock. "Hold!" Vance roared, standing on the brake pedal with his full weight. But gravity was a merciless enemy. The wagon, burdened by tons of unstable blasting powder, groaned and began to slide. It didn't slide backward. The camber of the narrow trail dragged the heavy rear end sideways, toward the abyss. Joe watched in numb horror as the left rear wheel drifted 3 inches, then 6. The edge of the cliff was a jagged black maw less than a foot away. The chock! Vance bellowed over the storm, his muscles bunching as he fought the thick leather reins, trying to keep the panicked horses from dragging them all over the edge. "Wedge it under the rim, now!" Joe lunged forward. She grabbed the freezing iron chain, dragging the heavy wooden block through the slush. The wagon groaned, slipping another 2 inches. Loose gravel and ice cascaded over the edge, disappearing into the void. She threw herself to her knees, right at the precipice. The wind clawed at her back, trying to push her over. She shoved the wooden block toward the wheel, but the angle was wrong. The iron rim was slick with ice. "It won't catch," Joe screamed, her voice tearing her raw throat. "Make it catch or we all go over," Vance roared back. Joe ripped off the heavy, clumsy leather work gloves with her teeth. She needed dexterity. She grabbed the splintering, freezing wood of the block with her bare hands. The iron band around the wood bit into her soft palms. She jammed the block directly under the curve of the massive wheel. "Pull!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Above her, the whip cracked like a cannon shot. The horses surged forward with a desperate, unified scream. The heavy iron rim of the wheel ground downward before it bit into the wood. The violent friction caught Joe's hands. The rough wood and freezing iron tore the skin from her palms, crushing her fingers against the frozen earth. White-hot agony spiked up her arms. Joe bit entirely through her lower lip to keep from pulling her hands away. The wheel gripped the block. The wood shrieked, but it provided the crucial fraction of an inch of traction the wagon needed. The massive vehicle lurched forward, fighting its way out of the lateral slide, its rear wheels grinding safely back onto the center of the rutted trail. Joe collapsed into the snow, gasping for air, her bare hands curled into tight, trembling fists against her chest. Warm blood dripped steadily from her torn palms, melting bright red holes into the pristine white snow. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind and the heavy, wet snorting of the horses. Heavy boots crunched through the snow. Vance rounded the back of the wagon. He held a kerosene lantern, its weak yellow light casting harsh, jagged shadows across his scarred face. He looked at the edge of the cliff, then down at the blood in the snow, and finally at Joe, who was struggling to push herself up with her elbows. He didn't ask if she was all right. In this country, you were either alive or dead. All right was a luxury nobody could afford. "We're stopping," Vance said flatly. "There's an overhang 50 yards ahead. The nitro is freezing. If we hit one more jolt like that, the impact won't matter because the blast wave will." He turned on his heel and walked back to the bench. 10 minutes later, Vance maneuvered the wagon beneath a shallow concave indentation in the mountain wall. It wasn't a cave, but the overhanging rock broke the direct assault of the blizzard, creating a small pocket of stagnant, freezing air. The adrenaline that had kept Joe moving evaporated, leaving behind a paralyzing exhaustion. She stumbled toward the front of the wagon. Vance was already unhitching the team, his movements brutally efficient. Joe moved to the nearest horse, an exhausted roan gelding. She reached up to unbuckle the frozen leather traces, but her fingers simply wouldn't work. The skin on her palms was shredded, the raw meat exposed to the biting cold. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't even grasp the buckle. She let out a frustrated, ragged breath, her vision blurring with unshed tears of pure physical pain. A large, leather-gloved hand reached over her shoulder and effortlessly released the buckle. "Go sit under the rock," Vance murmured. It wasn't a request. Jo didn't have the strength to argue. She retreated to the deepest part of the overhang, sinking down against the freezing stone wall. She pulled her knees to her chest, tucking her ruined, bleeding hands into the armpits of the buffalo coat, shivering until her teeth ached. She watched Vance work. He didn't stop. He secured the horses, rubbed them down with coarse burlap, and draped them in heavy woolen blankets. Then he moved to the wagon, carefully checking the ropes that secured the canvas over the volatile cargo. He was a machine built for survival, a man who had seemingly burned away every soft human vulnerability until nothing remained but iron and grit. Finally, Vance pulled a heavy canvas tarp and 2 frozen bedrolls from the storage box. He walked over to where Jo was huddled and threw the canvas over a pair of low boulders, creating a crude, slanted windbreak. He tossed one bedroll at her feet and unrolled the other a respectable distance away. There would be no fire. A stray spark near the sweating nitroglycerin would be suicide. There was only the darkness, the cold, and the howling storm outside their fragile sanctuary. Vance sat on his bedroll, his back resting against a boulder. He pulled a canteen from his coat, unscrewed the cap, and took a drink of half-frozen water. He tossed it to Jo. She caught it clumsily with her forearms, her breath hitching at the pain it caused her hands. She managed to pin the canteen between her knees and use her wrists to nudge the cap loose. She drank greedily, the icy water shocking her dry throat before nudging it back toward him. He caught it in silence. Jo leaned her head back against the stone, closing her eyes. The pain in her hands was a steady, throbbing fire, a cruel contrast to the freezing numbness creeping up her legs. She had lost her family, her home, her fortune. And now she was trapped on a frozen mountain with a man who carried explosives for a living and looked at her as if she were nothing more than a stubborn piece of cargo. But she hadn't broken. She had held the wheel. She drifted into a shallow, exhausted stupor, suspended somewhere between sleep and hypothermia. Sometime later, the sound of heavy boots crunching on stone pulled her back to consciousness. Jo opened her eyes, her heart giving a sluggish thump. The space beneath the windbreak was empty. Vance was gone, likely checking the perimeter or the horses. Jo let out a shaky breath and slowly pulled her hands from the warmth of her armpits. In the dim, gray light filtering through the storm, she could see the damage. The skin was torn and blistered, the cuts deep where the iron rim had crushed her fingers against the wood. Dirt and splinters were ground into the raw flesh. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the urge to weep. Crying wouldn't clean the wounds. Crying wouldn't save her. As she shifted her weight to reach for a handful of clean snow to wash her palms, her knee brushed against something hard resting on the edge of her bedroll. Jo paused. She squinted in the gloom. Sitting perfectly centered on the rough wool of her blanket was a small, dented tin. Trembling, Jo used the sides of her wrists to slide the tin closer. She nudged the lid off. The sharp, pungent smell of sulfur, pine tar, and beeswax hit her nose. It was a crude, heavy-duty healing salve, the kind drivers used on harness galls and split hooves. Jo looked up. Through the gap in the canvas windbreak, she saw Vance standing near the edge of the cliff. His back was to her, his collar turned up against the wind, a solitary, immovable shadow standing guard against the abyss. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't offered a shred of pity. Jo dipped 2 trembling fingers into the tin and began to work the stinging, foul-smelling salve into her torn, bleeding palms. It burned like liquid fire, but as the thick ointment coated the raw nerve endings, the sharpest edge of the agony began to dull. She wrapped her throbbing hands in the clean, dry strips of linen she tore from the hem of her ruined silk blouse. As she pulled the buffalo coat tighter around herself, settling back into the freezing dark, Joe looked at the dented tin, then back to the imposing silhouette of the scarred man outside. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't comfort. But out here, on the edge of the world, it was the closest thing to a promise that she wasn't going to die alone. Dawn on Predator's Pass did not arrive with sunlight. It crept in as a bruised, sickly gray pallor that merely diluted the pitch black of the storm. When Josephine Sterling forced her eyes open, her eyelashes were frozen together. She shattered the ice with a clumsy blink, drawing a breath that felt like inhaling powdered glass. Her muscles were locked in a rigor mortis of exhaustion and cold. A few feet away, the canvas windbreak was already gone. Vance Calder was throwing the heavy leather harnesses over the backs of the draft horses. He moved with the relentless mechanical rhythm of a man who knew that stopping meant dying. Jo gritted her teeth and pushed herself up from the frozen rock. Fire lanced through her palms. She looked down at her hands, wrapped tightly in the stained strips of her silk blouse. The pungent medicinal smell of the pine tar salve masked the copper scent of her own blood. It had kept the infection at bay and softened the raw meat of her torn skin, but every slight movement was still an agony that made her stomach pitch. She didn't wait for him to bark an order. She shoved her bandaged hands back into the oversized leather work gloves, biting her lip so hard she tasted copper again, and stumbled out from under the rocky overhang. Vance didn't look up as she approached the lead roan. He simply tossed a frozen leather trace in her direction. It hit the snow at her feet. Jo bent down, her spine screaming, and picked it up. Her fingers were clumsy, thickened by the heavy gloves and the swelling underneath, but she forced them to work. She fumbled with the heavy iron buckles, struggling to thread the stiff, iced-over leather. It took her 3 agonizing attempts, her breath coming in ragged white plumes, before she heard the satisfying click of the metal engaging. She moved to the next horse, then the next. When she finally finished her side of the team, she looked up. Vance was standing by the wagon wheel, watching her. His gray eyes tracked the fresh blood seeping through the crude silk bandages and staining the inside of her oversized leather gloves. He didn't offer a word of praise. He didn't offer pity. He just turned and swung his massive frame up onto the driver's bench. "We hit the summit in 2 miles," Vance rumbled, his voice cutting through the shrieking wind. "The timberline is gone. It's a flat expanse of dead rock and sheer ice. There's nothing up there to break the wind." Jo moved toward the rear wheel, preparing to grab the heavy iron chain of the brake shoe. "Leave it," Vance ordered. Jo stopped, looking up at him in confusion. Vance stared down at her from the high bench. "The grade level's out at the top. The danger isn't sliding backward anymore. It's the crosswind. It can blow a man right off his feet and over the edge. You walk behind the wagon up there, you'll be swept into the canyon." He jerked his chin toward the empty wooden slat beside him. "Get up here." Jo stared at the bench. To sit beside him meant leaving the agonizing physical labor that had kept her blood pumping. But it also meant facing the brunt of the high-altitude gale directly. She didn't argue. She grabbed the iron handhold bolted to the wagon box. Pain exploded in her palms, but she hauled her weight up, her boots slipping on the iced wooden spokes, until she collapsed onto the hard wooden bench beside him. Vance didn't wait for her to catch her breath. "Yah!" he roared, snapping the reins. The wagon groaned, the frozen axles popping like gunfire before the wheels ground forward. They breached the summit of Predator's Pass 20 minutes later. Vance hadn't exaggerated. It was a barren lunar landscape of scoured black rock and treacherous sheets of solid blue ice. But it was the wind that was the true monster. It didn't just blow. It screamed. It was a horizontal, physical force that slammed into the side of the heavy Studebaker wagon, threatening to tip the tons of volatile nitroglycerin straight into the abyss. Vance was a statue carved of grit and muscle. His heavy boots were braced against the footboard, his massive shoulders bunched as he fought the reins, keeping the terrified, straining horses in a straight line. Every ounce of his focus was dedicated to keeping the wheels on the ice and the cargo from detonating. Beside him, Joe was losing the war. Without the grueling physical labor to generate body heat, the cold rapidly breached the defenses of the heavy buffalo coat. It seeped into her bones, slowing her heart, thickening her blood. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the night finally burned out, leaving nothing but an empty, echoing void of absolute exhaustion. The rhythmic, jarring sway of the wagon became a hypnotic pendulum. The blinding whiteout of the snow blurred into a meaningless, shifting canvas. I just need to close my eyes for a minute, Joe thought. Her mind was sluggish, the terrifying reality of hypothermia masking itself as a seductive, heavy blanket of peace. Just 1 minute. Her chin dropped to her chest. She fought it, jerking her head up, her eyes wide with sudden sluggish panic, but her body had nothing left to give. The heiress, the swamper, the survivor, all of them were out of fuel. The wagon hit a rut. Joe swayed violently. She didn't fall off the bench. Instead, as the darkness pulled her under, her body slumped sideways, seeking the nearest source of solid gravity. Vance felt the sudden, heavy impact against his right side. He didn't flinch. He didn't take his eyes off the treacherous ice ahead. But beneath the thick layers of his duster and wool shirts, every muscle in his torso locked into rigid, terrifying tension. He glanced down. Josephine Sterling was unconscious. Her body was completely limp, her head resting squarely against his shoulder. Her face was deathly pale, her dark lashes stark against cheeks that were flushed with the dangerous, deceptive pink of severe frostbite. Her ruined, bloodied hands rested limply in her lap. For Vance Calder, the physical contact was a shockwave. He hadn't been touched in 6 years, not since the flames, not since the agonizing heat had seared the skin from his back and the soul from his chest. The right side of his body, right where her cheek now rested, was a ruin of puckered, tightened scar tissue. He had spent half a decade ensuring no human being ever got close enough to see it, let alone touch it. His immediate visceral instinct was to shove her away, to violently reject the warmth, the proximity, the terrifying vulnerability of another human being pressing against his damaged flesh. The ghost of the fire screamed in the back of his mind, a chorus of agonizing memories demanding isolation. He tensed his shoulder, fully intending to push her back upright. But then he felt it. Through the heavy canvas of his coat, he felt the faint, shallow rhythm of her breathing. He felt the violent, involuntary shivers racking her small, exhausted frame. He looked at her hands again. The crude silk bandages stained with the blood she had shed to keep his wagon from plummeting off the cliff. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't quit. She had stared down the abyss and held the line with nothing but her bare, bleeding hands. Vance's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. He looked back up at the blinding white maelstrom. The wind was howling, a merciless executioner seeking to freeze the life out of the fragile woman collapsed against him. He had sworn he was a ghost. He had sworn the fire had burned away everything inside him capable of caring, of protecting, of feeling. He hauled explosives because he didn't care if he lived or died. But as the icy gale battered the wagon, Vance Calder made a choice. He didn't push her away. Instead, he shifted his massive grip on the heavy leather reins, holding all 6 draft horses with his left hand. With a slow, deliberate movement, he shifted his entire body on the wooden bench. He turned his broad right shoulder and his thick chest directly into the teeth of the howling wind, creating a solid, immovable windbreak. He leaned into her slightly, trapping her fragile warmth between his own body heat and the heavy buffalo coat, shielding her face from the razor-sharp ice. It was a small shift, a matter of inches. But as the rhythmic swaying of the wagon continued and Joe's breathing steadied against the ruined, scarred flesh of his shoulder, Vance felt a terrifying, agonizing pressure building in his chest. It wasn't the cold. It was the ice around his heart, cracking for the very first time. Consciousness returned to Josephine Sterling not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow, agonizing thaw. The shrieking wind that had battered her ears for hours had dulled to a low, distant moan. The air, though still biting, carried a different texture, thicker, laden with the sharp tang of coal smoke and wet pine. The rhythmic, jarring sway of the Studebaker wagon remained, but the terrifying slip of iron wheels on solid ice had been replaced by the heavy, sucking sound of hooves churning through freezing mud. Joe's eyes fluttered open. Her vision was blurred, her cheek resting against something impossibly solid, radiating a deep, steady heat that contrasted sharply with the surrounding chill. She blinked, her mind sluggish. The texture beneath her face wasn't the rough canvas of her buffalo coat, nor the freezing wood of the wagon box. It was a heavy, waxed duster. She could smell old leather, stale tobacco, and the sharp, medicinal sting of pine tar salve. She was slumped entirely against Vance Calder. Her head was tucked beneath the heavy shelf of his jaw, her face pressed flush against his right shoulder. Worse, Vance had shifted his entire body to shield her, taking the brutal, freezing crosswinds squarely against his own back. He was holding all 6 reins in his massive left hand, his right arm braced against his knee to keep her from sliding off the bench. A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline cut through Joe's exhaustion. She jerked upright, pulling away from him so fast her head spun. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice a raw, sandpaper rasp. She scrambled to the far edge of the wooden bench, pulling the buffalo coat tightly around her trembling frame. "I didn't mean to." Vance didn't look at her. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking violently near the edge of his beard. He kept his gray eyes fixed firmly on the muddy road ahead. "You stopped shaking," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth his body had just provided. "People who stop shaking in a blizzard don't wake up. You were dead weight." It was a harsh, practical excuse, delivered to maintain the impenetrable wall he had built around himself. But Joe wasn't a fool. She saw the rigid tension in his shoulders. She realized what it must have cost a man so aggressively isolated to allow another human being that close, even to save her life. "Thank you," she said quietly. Vance's grip on the leather reins tightened until his knuckles turned white beneath his gloves. He didn't acknowledge the gratitude. He simply lifted his chin toward the valley below. "We're here." Joe followed his gaze, and her breath hitched. Silver Ridge wasn't a town. It was an open wound in the side of the mountain, a sprawling, chaotic scar of raw timber, corrugated iron, and churning mud. Black smoke belched from a dozen massive brick chimneys, painting the low-hanging clouds the color of bruised iron. The relentless, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the ore stamp mills echoed off the canyon walls like the heartbeat of a buried giant. It was ugly, brutal, and teeming with desperate life. Vance guided the heavy powder wagon down the main thoroughfare. The street was a river of freezing muck, choked with freight wagons, pack mules, and miners covered in gray rock dust. But as the crowd caught sight of the faded red danger warnings stenciled on the sides of Vance's wagon, they scrambled out of the way, giving the explosives a wide, terrified berth. Vance pulled back on the reins, bringing the exhausted team to a halt in front of a sturdy 2-story building that served as the town's assay office and primary mercantile. "I deliver the powder out back," Vance said, wrapping the reins around the brake lever. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes taking in her pale face and the bloody silk rags wrapped around her hands. "The assayer handles land claims and deeds. You go in, file your paperwork, and get off my wagon." It was a dismissal. The partnership forged in the ice of Predator's Pass was over. Joe swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding stiffly. She climbed down from the bench, her boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing mud. Her legs trembled violently, but she forced herself to stand straight, clutching her leather satchel to her chest. She pushed through the heavy oak doors of the assay office. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and paper dust. The room was crowded, but a path cleared as Joe approached the main counter. She reached into her satchel with her bandaged, throbbing hands and pulled out the crinkled, water-stained deed. "Excuse me," Joe said to the clerk behind the iron grill. I need to register this deed. It belongs to the Sterling estate. Plot 42, the Eastern Ridge. The clerk took the paper, adjusting his spectacles. He read it once, then looked up at Joe, a nervous, almost pitying expression crossing his face. He didn't speak to her. Instead, he looked over her shoulder. "I'm afraid there's a problem with that claim, Miss Sterling." The voice didn't come from the clerk. It came from behind her. Joe turned. Standing near the cast-iron stove was a man impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit and a silk cravat, looking entirely out of place in the grime of Silver Ridge. He had a handsome, sharply angular face, but his eyes were like polished obsidian, cold, reflective, and completely dead. Flanking him were three heavily armed men in long dusters. "Allow me to introduce myself," the man said, stepping forward with a smooth, predatory grace. "Harlan Cross. I own the Silver Ridge Mining Consortium, and as of last week, I own your father's outstanding debts." Joe's heart slammed against her ribs. This was the man her father's creditors answered to, the architect of her ruin. "My father's debts were settled when his newspaper and estate were liquidated in Boston," Joe said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "This deed is unencumbered." "Not quite," Harlan smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. He stepped to the counter and laid down a heavy leather-bound ledger, opening it to a marked page. "Your father borrowed an additional $20,000 directly from my consortium to fund his aggressive geological surveys in this territory. He signed a promissory note putting Plot 42 up as collateral. Since he is deceased and the debt is in default, the land is mine." He slid a piece of parchment across the glass counter. It was a formal contract bearing a signature that looked devastatingly like her father's elegant script. Joe stared at the paper. Despair, thick and suffocating, began to close in around her. The bounty hunters at the station hadn't just been sent to capture her. They were sent to ensure she never made it here to contest this. Harlan gestured to one of his armed men. "Marshal Teague, please escort Miss Sterling to the boarding house. She's had a rough journey. We can discuss how she might work off the remaining balance of her father's debt tomorrow." The man wearing a tarnished silver star stepped forward, reaching for Joe's arm. "Touch her, and you'll be pulling back a stump." The low, gravelly threat sliced through the room like a physical blade. Everyone turned. Vance Calder stood in the doorway. He hadn't drawn his Colt, but his hand rested casually over the walnut grip. The raw, violent aura radiating from him caused the marshal to instantly freeze, his hand hovering inches from Joe's sleeve. Harlan Cross's eyes narrowed, assessing the scarred, towering driver. "This is a legal matter, friend. The lady's land is forfeit. I have the signed contract right here." Vance's jaw tightened. He looked at Joe. He was a man who hauled explosives. He didn't fight legal battles. He was ready to draw his gun, ready to turn the assay office into a slaughterhouse to get her out of there. It was a suicide play against four armed men. Joe saw the violent shift in Vance's posture. No, she thought, no more blood. She looked down at the contract on the counter. Her father's signature. The date, 1870, 5 years ago. Her mind, honed by years of running the editorial and production floors of the largest newspaper in Massachusetts, snapped into razor-sharp focus. She noticed the slight feathering of the ink on the heavy parchment. She noticed the hue. "Mr. Cross," Joe said, her voice suddenly echoing with quiet, absolute authority. She stepped directly between Vance and Harlan, blocking Vance's line of fire. "You claim my father signed this in Boston 5 years ago?" "I do," Harlan said, his smile faltering slightly at her sudden shift in demeanor. Joe reached into her leather satchel. She bypassed her spare clothes and pulled out a small, heavy glass vial sealed with a cork. "My father was an obsessive man," Joe said loudly, ensuring the dozen miners and clerks in the room could hear every word. "He owned a printing empire. He despised modern chemical dyes because they faded in sunlight. For all his personal and legal correspondence, he exclusively used traditional iron gall ink. It cures into the paper fibers, turning a distinct rusted brown after a year. Harlan's eyes flicked to the vial in her hand. What is your point? My point, Mr. Cross, is that the signature on this 5-year-old document is jet black. Joe unstoppered the vial. A sharp, astringent chemical smell filled the immediate air. It was a high-grade photographic solvent she used for cleaning etched printing plates. Before Harlan or the marshal could react, Joe tipped the vial, letting a single heavy drop of the clear chemical fall directly onto the tail end of her father's forged signature. The reaction was instantaneous. Instead of holding fast like cured iron gall, the black ink immediately liquefied. It bubbled slightly and then violently bled outward into the parchment fibers, turning a bright neon purple. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Aniline dye, Joe announced, her voice ringing out like a judge's gavel. A cheap synthetic coal tar derivative. It hasn't even been in the paper long enough to dry properly. This signature wasn't written 5 years ago. It was written this week. She turned her fierce, blazing eyes to the local lawman. Marshal Teague. As an officer of the law, are you prepared to enforce a demonstrably forged document in front of a dozen witnesses, thereby making yourself an accessory to federal fraud? The marshal swallowed hard, his face turning pale. He looked at Harlan, then at the bleeding purple ink, and finally at Vance, whose hand was still resting on his revolver, looking highly eager for an excuse to use it. The marshal took 2 slow steps backward, raising his hands. It's a civil dispute, Mr. Cross. Until a circuit judge rules on that ink, the original deed holds. I ain't getting involved in forgery. Harlan Cross's handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stared at the ruined forgery, then up at Joe. For a second, the polished facade dropped, revealing the ruthless killer beneath. You're a very clever girl, Miss Sterling, Harlan said softly, his voice a venomous hiss. But cleverness doesn't stop a bullet, and it certainly won't keep you warm on a barren patch of dirt. He snatched the ruined contract off the counter. This isn't over. He turned and stormed out of the assay office, his men trailing quickly behind him. The silence in the room was absolute. Jo stood at the counter, her knees suddenly weak, the glass vial trembling in her bandaged hands. She hurriedly jammed the cork back in and shoved it into her satchel, retrieving her verified deed from the stunned clerk. She turned around. Vance was staring at her. The lethal, coiled tension in his muscles had evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unmasked disbelief. He looked at the spot where the purple ink had stained the glass counter, and then up at her face. He had expected her to cower. He had expected to have to kill 4 men to save her life. Instead, this bruised, freezing, exhausted Eastern heiress had just publicly humiliated the most dangerous man in the territory using nothing but a drop of liquid and her own brilliant mind. Vance let his hand fall away from his gun. A muscle twitched in his jaw, fighting an entirely new foreign expression. Aniline dye? Vance murmured, his voice incredibly low. Jo pulled her buffalo coat tighter around her shoulders, offering him a shaky, adrenaline-fueled smile. Chemistry, Mr. Calder. Vance stared at her for a long moment, the cracked ice around his heart giving way just a fraction more. He tipped the brim of his hat. Come on, Vance grunted, turning toward the door. Let's go find your dirt. Plot 42 was a graveyard of broken promises. Located 3 miles outside the soot-choked valley of Silver Ridge, the land was a jagged, unforgiving expanse of frozen mud and dead scrub brush. Sitting near the center of the barren lot was a dilapidated single-room homesteader's cabin. Its roof sagged like a broken spine, and the wind whistled a mournful tune through the gaps in the warped pine boards. Vance pulled the heavy wagon to a halt in front of the structure. He tied off the reins and jumped down, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. He didn't say a word as he walked up to the cabin, kicked the warped door open, and stepped inside. Jo followed slowly, her bandaged hands tucked into the pockets of her oversized coat. The inside of the cabin smelled of dry rot, abandoned nests, and the bitter cold. There was a crude stone hearth on the far wall, a rickety wooden table, and a bed frame stripped to its rope webbing. It was utterly desolate. But as Joe stepped over the threshold, a strange, fierce possessiveness bloomed in her chest. It was ugly and it was freezing, but Harlan Cross didn't own it. She did. Vance was already moving. He hauled in an armful of dry kindling he kept tarped on the wagon, dumping it into the hearth. "Chimney looks clear," he grunted, striking a match against the stone. Within minutes, a small, desperate fire was cracking in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the dusty floorboards. The heat was meager, but after the brutal exposure of Predator's Pass, it felt like standing in the sun. "Sit," Vance ordered, gesturing to a sturdy wooden crate near the fire. Joe obeyed, her exhausted legs finally giving out. She watched as Vance walked back to the wagon and returned with his saddlebags and a heavy iron canteen. He set them on the table and turned toward the fire. For the first time since the Denver station, Joe saw him wince. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. Vance reached his left hand over his right shoulder, gripping the thick canvas of his duster. He had taken the brunt of the crosswinds on the pass, leaning his entire body weight into the storm to shield her, and fighting 6 panicked draft horses with one arm. "You're hurt," Joe said, her voice raspy. Vance didn't look at her. "Tore a muscle on the brake lever. Maybe popped a seam on an old wound. It's nothing." He unbuckled his gun belt, laying the heavy Colt .45 on the table. Then, with agonizing slowness, he shrugged off the heavy, waxed duster. Beneath it, his thick wool shirt was stiff with frozen sweat, and a dark, terrifying patch of dried blood seeping through the fabric near his right shoulder blade. Joe stood up. "That isn't nothing." "Sit down, Boston," Vance growled, his voice a low warning. He began to unbutton his shirt with stiff, clumsy fingers. "I've patched worse in the dark." Joe didn't sit. She walked over to her satchel, pulled out the tin of pine tar salve he had given her on the mountain, and stepped into the dim light of the fire. "Take it off." Vance froze. His hands stopped on the buttons of his shirt. He slowly turned his head, his gray eyes pinning her to the floor. The look in them was feral, a wild, cornered animal terrified of the light. "No," he said flatly. "You can't reach your own shoulder, Vance," Joe said, keeping her voice incredibly soft, stripping away the command and leaving only logic. "You shielded me on that bench for hours. You bled to keep us on that cliff. Let me help you." The silence in the cabin was heavier than the blizzard outside. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. Vance stared at her, searching her face for the inevitable disgust he knew was coming. Finding only quiet, unwavering resolve, he closed his eyes. A muscle feathered in his jaw. With a ragged exhale that sounded like a defeat, he reached up, gripped the collar of his blood-stiffened shirt, and pulled it over his head. Joe's breath caught in her throat. The front of his torso was a map of hard, corded muscle, bruised purple and yellow from the grueling drive. But as he turned slightly, presenting his back to the firelight, the true devastation was revealed. From the base of his neck, stretching diagonally across his right shoulder blade and cascading down his spine, his skin was completely gone. In its place was a horrific, violently textured landscape of burn scars. Thick, ropey bands of melted, puckered tissue pulled the surrounding skin tight. It was a chaotic, brutal canvas of survival, glossy and pale in the firelight. Near the top of his shoulder, the violent exertion of the wagon drive had torn the fragile, scarred tissue. A fresh, jagged fissure wept dark blood down the ruin of his back. Joe didn't gasp. She didn't cover her mouth. Vance stood rigid, his massive shoulders hunched, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was waiting for the horror. He was waiting for the pity. "6 years ago," Vance said. His voice was gravel, barely louder than the crackling fire. He didn't look back at her. Staring at the stone wall, he recited the facts like an executioner reading a sentence. "A cabin in Texas, a lightning strike on dry timber. I was in the barn." He swallowed hard, the muscles in his thick neck working. My wife, my 4-year-old girl, they were inside. The words came out chopped, fragmented by an agony that time had never dulled. I tried to get through the door. The roof came down. I wasn't fast enough. I burned. They didn't make it out. He stopped. The silence rushed back in, suffocating and absolute. He had laid his darkest shame, his ultimate failure, bare on the floorboards between them. He waited for her to tell him it wasn't his fault. He waited for the hollow, useless platitudes people offered to the grieving to make themselves feel better. Time heals. They are in a better place. You did all you could. Jo said nothing. She unscrewed the lid of the tin. She scooped a generous amount of the thick, foul-smelling salve onto 2 fingers. She stepped up directly behind him. Vance flinched as she gently applied the ointment to the fresh bleeding tear on his shoulder. Her touch was incredibly light, but her hands were trembling. As she worked the salve into the torn tissue, she traced the edges of the horrific, puckered scars. She didn't offer a single word of pity. She knew words couldn't reach a man buried under 6 years of ash. Instead, Jo finished applying the salve. She wiped her hands on her ruined skirt. Then she took a half-step forward, closing the distance between them. Slowly, deliberately, Jo leaned forward. She turned her head and pressed her soft, cold cheek directly against the most mangled, ruined stretch of scar tissue in the dead center of his back. Vance's entire body went rigid. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. She didn't pull away. She wrapped her bandaged arms around his waist, pressing her chest against his back, anchoring him to the present, to the earth, to her. She held him with a fierce, silent ferocity, accepting every ounce of his ugliness, his failure, and his pain. Vance Calder closed his eyes. For 6 years he had believed he was a monster made of dead ash. But as the warmth of her cheek bled into the cold, dead nerves of his scars, a single tearing sob ripped its way out of his throat. He reached down, his large, calloused hands covering her bandaged ones at his waist, gripping her as if she were the only solid thing left in a burning world. 2 days later, the cold reality of Silver Ridge set in. Vance had taken one of the draft horses into town before dawn to trade a spare harness for canned goods and ammunition. Harlan Cross had been publicly humiliated in the assay office, but a man like that didn't swallow his pride. He sharpened his knives. Vance knew an attack was coming. Left alone in the freezing cabin, Jo didn't wait to be rescued. She sat at the rickety wooden table, her breath pluming in the cold air, poring over the contents of her father's leather satchel. It was a chaotic mess of geological survey maps, core sample data, and frantic, hastily scribbled journals. Her father hadn't been a miner. He had been a newspaper magnate looking to invest in Western infrastructure. Why had he borrowed $20,000 to buy a barren, rocky slope 3 miles outside of town? Jo traced her finger over a cross-section map her father had drawn. The lines intersected beneath Plot 42, pointing toward the massive interconnected grid of Harlan Cross's existing silver mines in the valley below. Then she found it. A single page stained with coffee and desperation. "Cross is a butcher," her father had written in his elegant script. "He's stripping the supporting pillars in the lower shafts to extract the last veins of ore. The entire eastern drift is unstable. A collapse isn't a possibility. It's a mathematical certainty. Hundreds will die. He needs capital to abandon the town before the mountain falls. I won't let him sell this graveyard to unsuspecting investors." Jo's blood ran cold. Harlan wasn't just a thief. He was building a mass grave. He needed her land because it sat directly above the eastern drift. If her father had exposed him, the miners would strike, the investors would flee, and Harlan's empire would crumble. Jo slammed the journals shut. She couldn't fight Harlan with a gun. She couldn't fight him in a corrupted court. But Josephine Sterling was the daughter of the press. She knew how to start a war. She packed her satchel and walked the 3 miles into Silver Ridge, keeping to the shadows of the tree line. The town was distracted by the afternoon shift change at the mills. Jo slipped through the muddy alleys until she found the building she had spotted from Vance's wagon 2 days ago. It was a boarded-up storefront with a faded, peeling sign. The Silver Ridge Gazette. Harlan had likely starved the local printer out of business months ago to control the flow of information. Jo jimmied the back lock with a rusty nail and slipped inside. It smelled beautifully of lead oxidation and dried ink. In the center of the dusty room sat a Washington hand press. It was archaic but mechanically sound. Jo threw off her coat. Despite her healing bandaged hands, she moved with the fluid, ingrained muscle memory of a woman who had grown up on a production floor. She found the type cases, pulling the tiny lead letters with rapid, clicking precision. She arranged them on the composing stick, spelling out the damning truth her father had died for. She detailed the stripped pillars, the impending collapse of the Eastern Drift, the forged deeds. She found a half-empty tin of thick black ink, rolled it onto the platen, and set a stack of cheap yellowed newsprint into the press. She grabbed the heavy iron lever. Her torn palms screamed in protest, but she threw her weight backward, pressing the paper against the inked lead. She printed 50 copies, then 100. By nightfall, under the cover of the swirling snow, Jo moved like a phantom through the mining camp. She nailed the broadsheets to the doors of the saloons. She slipped them into the bunks of the workers' barracks. She plastered them on the supporting timbers of the mine entrance itself. She struck a match, lit the fuse of a revolution, and slipped back into the dark. By the time Jo returned to the cabin on Plot 42, her hands were bleeding through their bandages again, but her eyes were fiercely bright. Vance was waiting. The meager fire was lit, and 2 cans of beans were heating on the hearth. He took one look at her ink-stained fingers, her flushed face, and the defiant set of her jaw. He didn't ask what she had done. He simply pulled out a chair for her. Eat. They ate in a comfortable, heavy silence. The impenetrable wall between them had shattered 2 nights ago when she pressed her cheek to his scars. There was an unspoken understanding now, a tether binding them in the dark. Vance stood up to clear the empty tins. "Vance," Jo said softly. He turned, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "When this is over," Jo started, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When the truth is out, what are you going to do?" Vance stared at her. He looked at the ink on her hands, the intelligence in her eyes, the sheer, undeniable gravity she exerted on his soul. For the first time in 6 years, he thought about a tomorrow that didn't involve explosives and a death wish. He opened his mouth to speak. Then the smell hit him. It wasn't the dry, dusty smell of burning pine from the hearth. It was the sharp, chemical, sickly sweet stench of raw kerosene. Vance's head snapped toward the boarded-up window. "Get down!" He lunged across the table, tackling Jo to the floorboards just as the front window shattered. A glass bottle, trailing a rag soaked in flaming kerosene, spun through the air and smashed against the far wall. Liquid fire exploded across the dry, rotted timber of the cabin. Within seconds, the room was bathed in a hellish, roaring orange light. The dry wood went up like tinder. Smoke, thick and black, instantly dropped from the ceiling. "Harlan," Jo coughed, scrambling backward. "He found the press." Vance scrambled to his feet, his hand dropping to his Colt. He turned toward the door to kick it open, to drag her out into the snow and fight. But as he stood up, the wall behind the hearth collapsed in a shower of sparks and roaring, hungry flames. The heat hit Vance's face like a physical hammer. The roar of the fire filled his ears, a deafening rushing sound exactly like the roar of the barn in Texas. The orange light danced across his vision, blinding him to the present. Click! The mechanism in Vance Calder's brain snapped. The present evaporated. He wasn't in Colorado. He was in Texas. He was 25 years old, staring at a burning door, his hands blistered, his lungs burning. "Vance, Daddy, please!" The phantom screams echoed in his skull, overriding reality. His breathing turned into rapid, shallow gasps. The Colt slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Vance dropped to his knees. He brought his massive hands up, gripping the sides of his head, his eyes blown wide, staring into the flames but seeing only ghosts. "Vance!" Joe grabbed his arm, pulling with all her might. He was immovable, a statue of pure, unadulterated trauma. "Vance, snap out of it! We have to move!" She slapped his face hard. He didn't blink. He was trapped in the inferno of his own mind, paralyzed by the horrific, paralyzing grip of PTSD. He had reverted to the man who couldn't save his family. The heavy wooden front door was suddenly kicked off its hinges. 3 men rushed into the burning cabin, their faces wrapped in bandanas. One of them held a rifle. The other 2 lunged for Joe. "Get off me!" Joe screamed, thrashing wildly. She kicked, clawed, and bit, but the men were too strong. They hauled her backward by her arms, dragging her toward the door. "Vance!" Joe shrieked, her voice tearing through the roar of the flames. "Vance, please, look at me!" Vance remained on his knees in the center of the burning room. He was staring at the flames devouring the wall, a single tear cutting a path through the soot on his cheek. He was deaf to her cries. The men dragged Joe out into the freezing night. A rifle butt came down hard against her temple. The world exploded in a flash of white, and then faded into absolute black. Inside the cabin, a burning crossbeam groaned, snapped, and crashed to the floor, showering Vance in sparks. The fire raged, and Vance Calder, broken and paralyzed, let the flames surround him, living his worst nightmare for the second time in his life. The cold brought him back, not the biting, howling wind of the pass, but the damp, suffocating chill of wet ash. Vance Calder opened his eyes to a world painted in bruised grays and charcoal blacks. He was lying face down in the snow 20 yards from the smoldering ruins of the cabin on Plot 42. Pure, ingrained survival instinct had driven his body out the back window moments before the burning roof caved in, but his mind had been miles away, trapped in a Texas inferno 6 years gone. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. His lungs burned, coated in a thick layer of soot. He coughed violently, a ragged sound that echoed off the empty frozen mountain. He looked at the cabin. The walls had collapsed inward. Only the stone hearth remained standing, a blackened tombstone in a graveyard of smoking timber. The silence was absolute. Vance stared at the ruins, the crushing, familiar weight of failure dropping onto his shoulders like an iron anvil. I let it happen again. The thought was a physical poison, paralyzing his limbs, darkening his vision. He had frozen. He had let the ghosts of his past dictate the present, and because of his cowardice, Josephine Sterling was gone. He dragged his eyes away from the ashes and looked at the snow. Amidst the debris and the soot, the tracks were clear, heavy boots, deep scuffles where a body had been dragged, and there, stark against the pristine white snow, a single drop of blood. Vance reached out with a trembling, soot-stained hand and touched the frozen crimson spot. It wasn't his blood. It was hers. Suddenly, a memory cut through the suffocating fog of his trauma. It wasn't the scream of his wife or the roar of the Texas flames. It was the feeling of Joe's soft, cold cheek pressing against the hideous ruined scars on his back. It was the fierce, unwavering grip of her bandaged hands anchoring him to the earth when he had expected her to run in horror. She hadn't looked at him like he was a monster. She had looked at him like he was a man worthy of being held. She wasn't dead in the ashes. She had fought, she had bled, and she had been dragged away into the dark by men who would show her no mercy. Vance Calder slowly rose to his feet. The man who stood up in the snow was not the ghost who had hauled powder across Predator's Pass. The ghost had burned away in the cabin. What remained was something far more dangerous. He turned his back on the ashes and walked toward the tree line where he had hobbled the draft horses and parked the wagon. The beasts snorted nervously, smelling the smoke on him. Vance didn't bother with the heavy coat he had abandoned. He walked straight to the back of the Studebaker. He threw off the canvas tarp and pried open a heavy wooden crate with his bare hands, ignoring the splinters biting into his palms. He pulled out 6 sticks of high-grade dynamite. He didn't handle them with the reverent, terrifying caution he usually employed. He shoved them into the deep pockets of his leather duster. He grabbed a coil of fuse and a box of sulfur matches. Finally, he knelt in the snow and picked up his heavy Colt .45 from where it had fallen when the fire started. He flipped the cylinder open, checking the brass casings in the dim morning light. 6 rounds. He snapped the cylinder shut. The sharp metallic clack rang out like a judge's gavel. He swung up onto the bare back of the massive lead roan, clutching his rifle in one hand and the reins in the other. He didn't look back at the ruined cabin. He turned the horse toward the valley, toward the black smoke belching from Harlan Cross's mining compound. He was coming for her, and he was bringing hell with him. The Silver Ridge Mining Consortium was less a business and more a fortress. Built against the sheer rock face of the valley, it was surrounded by a 10-foot palisade of raw timber, heavily guarded by men holding repeating rifles. Deep inside the compound, in the lavishly furnished office that sat directly over the main mine shaft entrance, Josephine Sterling was tied to a heavy oak chair. Her head throbbed with a sickening rhythm from the rifle butt, a thin line of dried blood crusting over her temple. Her hands, still wrapped in their ruined silk bandages, were bound tightly behind her back with coarse rope. Harlan Cross stood by the window, swirling a glass of amber whiskey. In his other hand, he held one of the broadsheets Joe had printed the night before. "I have to admit, Miss Sterling, I underestimated you," Harlan said, his voice smooth and deadly. "I thought you were just a pampered Eastern heiress, playing homesteader. I didn't realize you possessed your father's flair for the dramatic." He crumpled the broadsheet and tossed it into the potbelly stove. "The miners will read it," Joe rasped, her throat dry. "They'll know the Eastern Drift is going to collapse. They'll strike." "Let them," Harlan chuckled, turning to face her. "The Eastern Drift is tapped out anyway. If it collapses and buries 100 men, it just saves me the trouble of paying their wages." "That's the beauty of your father's little geological survey. He was so focused on the failing pillars he completely missed the real treasure." Joe glared at him. "There's no silver left on Plot 42. My father proved that." "Silver?" Harlan laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Miss Sterling, silver is a finite resource. You dig it up and it's gone. But water? In a mining camp that requires thousands of gallons a day to wash the ore, and a town of 3,000 desperate souls who need it to drink? Water is eternal." Harlan walked forward, leaning his hands on the arms of her chair, his face inches from hers. "Your father's core samples hit a layer of impenetrable granite beneath your plot. But beneath that granite is a massive pressurized underground aquifer, the only clean water source for 50 miles. Whoever controls that aquifer controls Silver Ridge forever. That's why I need your deed. And that's why you're going to sign it over to me right now." "I'd rather die," Joe spat. Harlan's smile vanished. He stood up, drawing a heavy revolver from his shoulder holster. "That can be arranged after you sign." A deafening, earth-shattering explosion ripped through the valley. The shockwave shattered the glass in Harlan's office window, raining shards across the mahogany desk. The heavy oak floorboards violently bucked beneath them. Alarms began to ring throughout the compound, followed immediately by the chaotic staccato popping of rifle fire. Harlan rushed to the broken window. The main timber gates of the compound were gone. In their place was a gaping, splintered crater of smoking ruin. Riding through the swirling smoke on a massive draft horse was Vance Calder. He wasn't driving a wagon. He was a one-man cavalry. He held the reins in his teeth, a Winchester repeating rifle in his right hand, and the Colt .45 in his left. "Kill him!" Harlan screamed at the guards below. Vance didn't flinch as bullets whipped past his head, burying themselves in the timber around him. He moved with a terrifying mechanical precision. He dropped the rifle, letting it hang by its sling, pulled a stick of dynamite from his pocket, bit down on the fuse, struck a match on his belt buckle, and hurled the explosive toward the guard tower. Another earth-shaking blast tore the tower apart. "Get her up!" Harlan barked to the two guards in the office. He grabbed Jo by the collar of her buffalo coat, hauling her out of the chair, ignoring her bound hands. "Into the mine! Move!" They dragged Jo out of the office and shoved her into the dark, yawning mouth of the main shaft. The air instantly turned damp and heavy, smelling of coal dust and rotting timber. Behind them, the sound of gunfire grew louder. Vance was carving a path through the compound, a relentless force of nature hunting its target. Harlan dragged her deeper into the tunnel, the light from the entrance fading into the oppressive gloom of the subterranean labyrinth. They reached a massive iron cage elevator. Harlan shoved her inside, the guards piling in after, and pulled the release lever. The cage dropped into the dark. "The Eastern Drift," Harlan ordered the guards as the cage slammed to a halt at the bottom of the shaft. "Take her to the Eastern Drift." They hauled her out into a massive cavern supported by ancient, groaning wooden pillars. The air here was incredibly thin, choked with the highly flammable coal dust that had settled over the years. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Harlan spun around, raising his revolver. Emerging from the shadows of the tunnel, lit only by the flickering glow of a single wall lantern, was Vance. His face was covered in soot, his duster torn by a grazing bullet, blood trailing down his jaw. But his gray eyes were locked entirely on Jo. "Let her go, Cross," Vance said, his voice a low, echoing rumble that vibrated against the stone walls. "You're a persistent bastard, Calder," Harlan sneered, keeping himself safely behind Jo, pressing the barrel of his revolver against her temple. "But you're out of your element. Drop the gun, or the girl's brains paint this rock." One of Harlan's guards, panicking at the sight of the scarred giant, didn't wait. He raised his rifle and fired wildly. The bullet missed Vance. It ricocheted off a rusted iron track, striking the glass casing of the wall lantern. The lantern shattered. The flaming oil splashed downward, hitting the thick layer of highly combustible coal dust covering the floor. It didn't just burn, it erupted. A wall of fire flashed across the cavern floor, rushing up the dry, rotting wooden pillars that held up the ceiling of the unstable Eastern Drift. Within seconds, the subterranean tunnel was a roaring, inescapable inferno. The heat hit Vance like a physical blow. The roar of the flames filled the cavern. No. The ghost of Texas reached for him. The paralyzing, suffocating grip of his trauma clamped down on his chest. His breathing hitched. The flames danced in his vision, morphing into the burning walls of the barn. He could feel his knees buckling. He could feel the paralysis setting in. Through the roaring fire, he heard a voice. "Vance!" He looked through the curtain of flames. Jo was struggling against Harlan's grip, her eyes wide with terror, but she wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking at him. "I will not fail her, not again." Vance Calder bit down on his tongue until he tasted blood. He shattered the paralysis with a surge of pure, violent will. He didn't look at the fire. He looked at the rock. He knew exactly where they were. He had hauled powder to every mine in this territory. The wall to his right, the one currently groaning under the shifting weight of the burning pillars, was the eastern boundary, the boundary of Plot 42. Harlan's men were coughing, blinded by the smoke. Harlan shoved Jo to the ground, trying to find an exit as the fire cut off the elevator. Vance didn't shoot. He dropped his gun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last 2 sticks of dynamite. They were sweating, highly unstable. He jammed them into a deep fissure in the eastern rock wall. He didn't have time for a long fuse. He cut it down to 2 inches. He struck a match. "Jo, down!" Vance roared, sprinting through the flames. Jo threw herself flat against the muddy floor. Vance dove over her, covering her small body entirely with his massive, heavy frame, burying her face against his chest. The dynamite detonated. The explosion in the confined space was deafening. It blew out eardrums and shattered the burning wooden pillars. The Eastern Drift began to collapse. millions of tons of rock groaning above them. But then came a new sound. It wasn't rock. It was a deep subterranean roar, like a freight train made of ice. The explosion had cracked the granite seal of the aquifer beneath Plot 42. A tidal wave of pure, freezing, high-pressure underground water exploded out of the shattered rock wall. It hit the cavern with the force of an avalanche. The water instantly obliterated the coal fire, plunging the cavern into hissing, steaming darkness. The violent surge caught Harlan Cross and his men, sweeping them off their feet and washing them screaming down into the black, flooded depths of the lower shafts. Vance drove his fingers into the muddy floor, bracing his boots against the base of a surviving iron stanchion, holding Joe desperately against his chest as the freezing torrent rushed over them, washing away the soot, the blood, and the fire. The surge lasted for a terrifying minute before the pressure equalized, leaving the cavern flooded waist-deep in freezing, churning water, the fire completely dead. Vance gasped for air, pulling Joe up by the lapels of her coat. "Joe, look at me!" She coughed, sputtering water, shivering violently, but her eyes were clear. She reached up with her bound hands, pressing her face against his neck. "You came back. You didn't freeze." "Never again," Vance whispered fiercely into her wet hair. He drew a knife from his boot and sliced the ropes binding her wrists. He scooped her up into his arms, wading through the flooded, ruined cavern, toward the shaft of gray light spilling from the emergency access ladder. When they finally emerged from the mine, the afternoon sun was breaking through the heavy clouds, casting a bruised golden light over the ruined compound. The surviving miners had surrendered, the sheriff was arriving, and the empire of Harlan Cross was officially dead. Vance didn't stop until they were far away from the wreckage, standing on a muddy ridge overlooking the valley. He set Joe down carefully. They were both soaked to the bone, covered in mud, soot, and bruises. They looked like they had been dragged through hell. Vance looked down at her. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a fortune. All he had was the truth. Slowly, Vance Calder dropped to one knee in the freezing Colorado mud. Joe's breath hitched. She stared down at him, her dark eyes wide. Vance reached out, offering her his bare, scarred right hand. "I swore I was dead inside," Vance said, his voice raw, stripped of all its defenses. "I swore I'd never let anyone in. I was a ghost, hauling powder, just waiting to hit a rock hard enough to end it. Until you." He looked up into her eyes, the gray in his own clear and fiercely alive. "Until you fell asleep on my shoulder and woke up my soul. I'm broken, Joe. I've got scars on the outside, and worse ones on the inside. I can't promise I won't ever wake up screaming from the past, but I swear to God, if you let me, I will be the shoulder you can lean on for the rest of your life." Joe didn't hesitate. She didn't look at his scars, or the mud, or the blood. She dropped to her knees in the mud right in front of him. She took his large, calloused, scarred hand in her own healing, bandaged ones, and pressed it tightly to her heart. "You aren't broken, Vance Calder," Joe whispered, tears finally cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "You're the strongest man I've ever known." She leaned forward, pulling him by the lapels of his ruined coat, and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, timid kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and entirely alive, tasting of smoke, rain, and the undeniable promise of tomorrow. Spring came to Silver Ridge not with a whisper, but with a roar. The melting snows from Predator's Pass rushed down the canyons, but it was nothing compared to the steady, crystal-clear torrent pumping from the newly constructed wooden water tower that loomed over the town. Painted in bold black letters across the timber siding were the words, "Sterling Well, the town had transformed." With Harlan Cross gone and the endless supply of clean water flowing from Joe's land, the miners had formed a cooperative. The air smelled less of coal smoke and more of wet pine and blooming sage. On a bright, crisp May morning, a small crowd gathered at the base of the water tower. There were no silk dresses or tailcoats, The guests wore clean denim, polished boots, and their Sunday-best calico. Josephine Sterling stood before the circuit judge. She wore a simple, pale blue cotton dress, her dark hair pinned back, revealing the faint, fading scar on her temple. Her hands, resting in Vance's, still bore the pale, silvery lines of the rope and the iron wheel, but they were strong and steady. Vance stood tall beside her. He wore a crisp white shirt and a dark vest, his collar open. He hadn't bothered to hide the scars that crept up his neck. He had nothing left to hide. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Vance didn't just kiss her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck, while the miners and townspeople cheered loud enough to rival the stamp mills. Later that afternoon, as the celebration moved down into the town, Vance and Joe walked hand in hand to the far edge of Plot 42. The ashes of the old cabin had been cleared away. In its place stood the sturdy framed skeleton of a new two-story ranch house. "The lumber yard says they'll have the roof finished by Tuesday," Joe said, leaning against his side. Vance nodded, looking past the house to the sprawling, fenced-in pasture that stretched toward the foothills. Grazing in the tall spring grass was a herd of 20 wild, magnificent Mustangs. He had sold the heavy Studebaker wagons. He had sold every ounce of nitroglycerin and blasting powder. The man who hauled death for a living had traded it all to build a life. "They're beautiful," Joe murmured, watching a fiery roan stallion trot along the fence line. "They need breaking," Vance said, his thumb tracing the silver scars on her palm. "Takes time, patience. Have to show them they aren't going to get hurt before they let you put a saddle on them." Joe looked up at him, a knowing, tender smile playing on her lips. "I know a thing or two about breaking stubborn things." Vance smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and erased the harsh years from his face. He pulled her close, resting his chin on the top of her head, watching the Mustangs run under the vast, open Colorado sky. He was home. 5 years later. The smell of smoke no longer brought terror. It only meant dinner was ready. Vance Calder sat on the wide wraparound porch of the Calder Ranch, a block of oiled leather in one hand and an awl in the other. He worked the leather with rhythmic, practiced ease, repairing a stirrup strap as the sun began its slow, golden descent behind the jagged peaks of Predator's Pass. The air was warm, carrying the sweet scent of baking bread from the open kitchen window and the earthy smell of the horses in the corral. "Vance," Joe's voice called from inside the house. "Tell your daughter that if she feeds one more biscuit to the hound, she's eating dog food for supper." Vance chuckled, a low, deep rumble in his chest. "You hear that, little bird?" He shifted his weight slightly. Slumped sideways against his chest, completely dead to the world, was a 4-year-old girl. She had a mop of chaotic dark hair and, when she was awake, eyes the exact color of a thunderhead, just like her mother. Her face was smeared with dirt and blackberry jam. She was breathing the slow, heavy rhythm of an exhausted child who had spent the entire day chasing barn cats and helping her father brush down the Mustangs. Her small, sticky cheek was resting squarely against the thick, puckered burn scars that crept up the right side of his neck and shoulder. Vance set the leather strap down on the porch railing. He didn't move to wake her. He carefully wrapped his massive, calloused arm around her small body, holding her secure. The screen door creaked open. Joe stepped out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She stopped, leaning against the doorframe, watching them. The fading sunlight caught the silver threads starting to weave through her dark hair, highlighting the deep, contented lines around her eyes. She looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully against the scars that had once defined her husband's nightmares. Vance looked up, catching her gaze. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Love in the West wasn't a fairy tale that saved you from your past. It wasn't a magic spell that erased the scars or made the memories disappear. It was the pure, unadulterated grit to stand in the ashes of your worst mistakes, take the hand of someone just as battered as you were, and choose to build a future anyway. Vance rested his cheek against the top of his daughter's dark head, looking out over the land that was theirs, the water that flowed freely, and the woman who had brought him back to life. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of smoke, and felt nothing but peace. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.